Now we're starting a new work by Kierkegaard, Fear and Trembling. This is one of his major works, and it gives you some of the most important themes that you see running through his entire corpus. It ties them together. It doesn't explore some of them in as great detail as he does in some of his other texts, but this is a great fulcrum point for thinking about the theme of the religious in relation to the ethical for Kierkegaard, and even the aesthetic, another lower stage of life for him. What I'm going to do is split this up into two lectures. The problemata, the sort of real, not all of the meat, but a good portion of the meat, I'm going to actually talk about in the next lecture. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about some of the preliminary material, which turns out not to be quite so preliminary. There's a lot of meat there. And about the structure of the work, and about some of the big overarching themes. And absolutely central to this work is the biblical story of Abraham and Isaac. In it, Abraham, one of the fathers of faith, one of the great fathers of the monotheistic religions, is posed with a terrible, one might even say horrible, choice that he has to make. And he chooses the right way, as we're told in the story. And we'll talk a little bit more about the particulars of that for those who aren't as familiar with the story. He chooses the right way in relation to God, but it's something that's very difficult to wrap your head around. In one sense, it's very easy. The story is actually not that very long. A lot of the stories in Genesis aren't. But to put yourself in his position and understand what was going on, that's a whole different ballgame. So we'll talk about that in a moment. Before that, though, one of the notes I want to hit on. Kierkegaard doesn't use this term dialectic an awful lot in this particular work. But his philosophy is dialectical, and oftentimes it's framed as if Kierkegaard is sort of the anti-Hegel. Hegel doesn't coin the term dialectic, that goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, but in modern times dialectic comes to take on different meanings. There is what we call dialectical philosophy, and Hegel is really at the center of early dialectical philosophy. And Hegel looks at all the things that are important for human beings: art, literature, economy, law, society, family, state, pick whatever you want, even down to things like perception. And he sees them as processes in which reason or consciousness or the distinctively human thing about us works itself out dynamically, oftentimes through oppositions, through negations, through things being placed in relation to each other and then having to sort of modify each other. Kierkegaard is doing something very similar. He's very critical of Hegel on a lot of points for where Hegel has gone, but he's actually doing something not that unlike what Hegel is doing. And the key things here in this are, what's the relationship between philosophy and faith? Is faith something that just precedes philosophy, which philosophy could work on like an object and perhaps even improve upon? Or is faith rather something like a limit point where philosophy has to stop and something else has to continue? Those are live questions, and part of the function of the dialectic is to work that out. Another thing that's not quite so often talked about with respect to this work, but I think is very important, I'm going to stress this point a number of times, is what is the relationship between Christianity as a religion, as a stance, as a way of thinking, living, believing, feeling, doing, relating oneself, and human life in general, with or without Christianity. So we're going to explore those in just a moment. So before we go into looking at the structure of it, I want to hit on some of the other basic notes of this work. Like I said, Abraham is absolutely central here. And the question that Kierkegaard is trying to wrap his head around is, what is Abraham? We know he's a guy in a story, and we know what he's a sort of model of. but really what is going on in Abraham? What does he stand for? Or better yet, what does he embody? That's an open question. Should Abraham, for example, be looked at as something like a hero, like a tragic hero, or a romantic hero? And we're going to see that Kierkegaard's answer to this is almost, but not. There's something fundamentally different for the tragic hero, if we want to think about Greek tragedy, or if we want to think about Shakespearean tragedy, or any other kind of tragedy. There's something different between Abraham and that sort of figure. If we think of tragedy in terms of the life of the mind, Socrates, for example, Abraham is not Socrates either. And you can ask yourself a question, who's better? Who's greater? Who actually embodies what is best in human beings, what is most fully human to a higher degree, Abraham or these other figures? Abraham is clearly also not a poet. Kierkegaard is going to talk about the poet in here, and he's actually going to figure himself in a certain way as being the poet. So far we've all just talked about what Abraham is not. We're going to get to what Abraham is in a little bit. But this brings up another important point, another important note to think about, to consider before we delve into it. Is Kierkegaard, or the character who he is having speak on his behalf, Johannes de Silentio, the supposed author of this book, is he actually a philosopher? In some sense, clearly yes. At the same time, he seems to be telling us that he's not a philosopher. And if we think of philosophers along the lines of, say, Descartes, or even Socrates, let alone Kant or Hegel, or some of the more academic types of our own time, it's a little hard to place Kierkegaard here as an actual philosopher. On the other hand, there's good reasons to think that he is a philosopher, so we're going to explore that as well. Another thing that he's going to stress is, and he's not framing it as such, but we can frame it in terms of this question. What is philosophy about, fundamentally? What is philosophy concerned with? And here we can see Kierkegaard just shining forth as an existentialist author. Philosophy is not just about linguistic questions, it's not just about abstract metaphysical questions that have no connection to our daily lives. It's not just about systems of ethics that you might get in a textbook. It is about what matters most. Philosophy, as Kierkegaard conceived of it, and as Hegel conceived of it, and as Socrates conceived of it, is a concern for what is best, what is greatest, how do we orient our lives around it. It's a practical activity, it's not just a speculative activity, the way that a lot of people have made it into. Even for Hegel, it's a practical activity. I know a lot of people don't see it that way, but that is something that you can see coming through his work. Another thing that you want to think about when it comes to philosophy is philosophy what is contained in books? Is it the concepts? Is it the system of ideas? Is it some sort of finished product which then you can purchase and acquire and assimilate and take on? Another way of putting this with a different metaphor is, if indeed there's progress and we stand on the shoulders of giants, do we thereby become those giants? By taking their vantage point, do we achieve what it is that they achieved? Do we attain what it is that they attained? Do we have at our disposal what they did? Are we affected in our being the way they were? So Kierkegaard's answer to that is no. We're going to see why. Another issue that comes up is, what is the relationship between philosophy and faith, but also to theology? This I'm not going to talk quite so much about. As a matter of fact, we can sum it up here by saying that Kierkegaard is actually, if you want to call him a theologian, he's a very anti-theological theologian. He prefers faith to theology because he sees theology as, in a certain way, philosophy-light. It's doing the same thing as philosophy, just not as well, and it's willing to sort of sell out faith on the way to win philosophy's favors. This is a very interesting theme because you can see such a big distinction between Kierkegaard and his view of faith and the way in which philosophy and theology were coordinated in the so-called Age of Faith in the Middle Ages. The idea was at that time that theology was the queen of the sciences and philosophy was her handmaid. In modern times, what we see is the queen falling on hard times and having to suck up an awful lot to philosophy in order to be taken seriously. And I think you can say that still goes on even today in a lot of different ways. So Kierkegaard has his finger on the pulse of something here. The last big theme that I want to stress as a basic note of this before we delve into it is going back to this question about Christianity and human life. It's very clear in Kierkegaard that the world has value apart from Christianity. The world has value to some degree, if you could conceive of it this way, apart from its connection to God. Human life has points and purposes, even if a person is not religious. Can it be as fully that way? Can a person who does not have faith, does not exercise faith, can they open themselves up as fully to reality as the knight of faith does? No, but that's not to say that that's nothing either. Kierkegaard thinks that it is possible to think, to connect oneself, to live a life which embraces the eternal and what is eternal in human beings without having religion. And this is a very important point. Very often, Christianity, or religion in general, gets sort of put in opposition to the world, as if it's everything in the world is no good unless you have Christianity. Or it denies the value of finite earthly existence. Or it becomes its own kind of replacement for the world. And Kierkegaard is very far away from anything like that. As a matter of fact, one of the things that he stresses about Abraham expected, whatever you want to call it, redemption, fulfillment, life being made plentiful, being made good. He expected that to happen in this life, in this world, in the world of finitude, in the world of experience, in the world which we know. That's part of what makes his stance so paradoxical. He didn't put it off to a distant, imagined heaven later on down the line that everything else could be sacrificed here and now to. He said, no, it's going to happen here. And Kierkegaard is saying that as well about faith. So, all those three notes, or not three, all those 5 notes pointed out, let's look at the structure of this work. And the real kernel around this is the section which is called problemata. Greek term, we get the word problem from it, and literally it means something sort of thrown in front of one, which one has to then engage with. And the problemata section has 4 parts. There is what he calls the preliminary expectoration. And expectoration, that's a Latin word. You could think of it literally as getting something off your chest, sort of unburdening yourself. Maybe, exercises before you get going. And then there are 3 problems. And then after that, there is an epilogue. Very short. Summing up some stuff, I'm going to read a little bit from it in just a moment. Before that, there is an exordium. And a eulogy. Now, you have these classical compositional or rhetorical terms being thrown in here. Why is Kierkegaard doing this? This work has a sort of structure to it. The same themes are going to get reinforced throughout it, but this is very typical Kierkegaard. He wants to approach the same problem from different angles. And different genres allow you to do that in complementary ways. So I don't think that this is one of those things where you want to try to break down each section and say, what exactly is going on here, only here, not in these other sections. Because they're finding echoes in the other sections as well. So let's look first at the exordium. What is going on in there? This is after a very, very short preface, which we're going to get to as well. In the exordium, he says, once upon a time there was a man who as a child had heard the beautiful story of how God tempted Abraham, and how Abraham withstood the temptation and kept the faith, and contrary to expectation, got his son a second time. And it's about this man who read the story over and over again, and as he got older and older and older, he understood the story less and less and less, but he was more and more passionately fascinated by it. And then Kierkegaard tells us these 4 sort of variations on the story of Isaac and Abraham. In the first one, he talks about Abraham, saddling up the asses, riding for 3 days, seeing Mount Moriah, taking Isaac up to the mountain himself. Abraham explains what's going on to Isaac, and Isaac it doesn't click with him. He begs his father for his life. Abraham turns around and his face is wild, full of horror, a terror to his son. And Isaac, turns away. And Abraham is actually putting on a show. He doesn't want his son to give up on God. And his son says, God in heaven, have mercy on me. God of Abraham, have mercy on me. If I have no father on earth, then you be my father. And Abraham breathes a prayer of thanks to God for that. Is that in the biblical tale? No. Kierkegaard is sort of exploring it. And this is a really interesting thing to think about. We have all these great narratives. Think about not just biblical tales, but also fairy tales. When they're told, there'll be one line talking about something happening. And so much would have gone on at that time. So much would have run through people's heads. So much would have weighed on them, and they would have wrestled with it. Kierkegaard is trying to put himself imaginatively into where Abraham is at that time. The second one, Abraham rises, embraces Sarah. He takes his son along, and they get to Mount Moriah. He arranges the firewood, draws the knife, then he sees the ram. But from that day, Abraham was old. He could not forget that God had ordered him to do this. Isaac flourished as before, but Abraham's eyes were darkened and he saw joy no more. This is a different way of interpreting the story. Again, is that in there? Is that in the original story? No, Kierkegaard is still trying to wrap his head around what's going on with Abraham. And there are several more variations that go on. I don't want to go into those too much. You can read those on your own. What I do want to talk about is now this eulogy on Abraham. And when we talk about a eulogy, the modern sense of the term has really lost some of the meaning that it had for the ancients, for medievals, and even the early moderns, and then into late modernity at the time of Kierkegaard. We think of a eulogy as something you deliver when somebody's died at their funeral, and anybody can do it. You just have to care about the person or have something nice to say. Well, that's a little bit of what a eulogy is. Strictly speaking, a eulogy means saying something good about another person. It's a form of praise. Aristotle actually talks about this in his book, The Rhetoric, as one of the examples of epidictic rhetoric. There's 3 genres of rhetoric for Aristotle. Aristotle thought this sort of thing was very, very important, not just for funerals. Eulogies reveal to us not just how we feel about somebody. They reveal to us something more general, more lofty, more necessary for us. What they reveal is the noble, the best, what is to be praised, why it ought to be praised, what is so great about it, what qualities or characteristics are important. So he's eulogizing Abraham. And why is he doing that? Well, because Abraham has something special about him. And he tells the story of Abraham. He says, Abraham was a man of faith. He's greater than any hero. He's greater than the poet who talks about the hero. He is the father of faith. He is the exemplar of that. So that's what's going on here in the eulogy. Then we have, like I said, the problemata section, and then we have the epilogue. So before we actually go into now dealing with these themes, I'm going to read a little bit of the epilogue. I'm going to skip all the way to the end. Kierkegaard says, faith is the highest passion in a person. There are perhaps many in every generation who do not come to faith, but no one who goes further. Then he says, life has tasks enough also for the person who does not come to faith, and if he loves these honestly, his life will not be wasted, even if it is never comparable to the lives of those who perceived and grasped the highest. But the person who has come to faith does not come to a standstill in faith. Indeed, he would be indignant if anyone said this to him. Just as the lover would resent if someone said that he came to a standstill in love. Yet he does not go further, does not go on to something else. For when he finds this, then he has another explanation. This is a really key passage. This wraps everything up, I think, very nicely. Faith is the highest passion in a person. That's one important point. Another important point, the person who exists in faith doesn't stop in faith as if it's a finished product that's all done. At the same time, they don't go on to something else. So this is a good time to now shift to looking at how Kierkegaard regarded the current cultural situation that he was in. And I think that we can see a lot of parallels still to our own cultural situation and how a lot of people look at religion. So the current philosophical or cultural view that he is criticizing of his time is what we might call a kind of consumerist view. Philosophy has generated all sorts of nice products, and we can just sort of appropriate them, make them our own, maybe by buying a book. If I buy the book, then somehow I know what's in the book. If I learn the language of the book, I'm now a philosopher. We can sort of pick up and use, get all the meat, all the marrow out of what others have attained. This is a very consumerist attitude towards spiritual life. And by spiritual life, I don't just mean religion. I'm not talking about, by the way, people who say, oh, I'm spiritual but not religious. For Kierkegaard, religion is part of spirituality. You know, it's the highest part of it. But philosophy is part of that as well. And so are other great intellectual things. Kierkegaard's view is that people in his time are kind of expecting other people to do their work for them. He has a great sort of discussion of this at the very beginning of the expectoration. He says, he's talking about people and this adage that he who doesn't work doesn't get bread, doesn't eat. And he says, well, in the external world, that's not the way it actually works. There's plenty of people who don't work and they do just fine, and there's plenty of people who work and they starve. But it's different in the world of the spirit. Here an eternal divine order prevails. Here it does not rain on both the just and the unjust. Here the sun does not shine on both good and evil. Here it holds true that only the one who works gets bread. Only the one who was in anxiety finds rest. That only the one who descends to the lower world rescues the beloved. That only the one who draws the knife gets Isaac. He who will not work does not get bread, but is deceived. And he talks about the gods deceiving Orpheus. Orpheus is this Greek figure whose wife Eurydice dies. Orpheus actually descends to the underworld to get her back and is told, okay, you can have her, because he causes a lot of trouble down there, but you can't look back at her on the way up. And they go all the way up, just about, to get out of Hades, and then she stumbles and she cries out, he turns back, and she disappears. And the tradition is, it was never really her, it was just a phantom. He was deceived. Well, many people are similarly deceived by thinking that because they buy a book of Kierkegaard or Nietzsche or Hegel and they read some of it, or they go on to Twitter or Facebook or pick whatever you like and chat about philosophy, that they have therefore imbibed philosophy, they're living a philosophical life. And even for philosophy, Kierkegaard would say, well, that's not true. Here's where existential philosophy is particularly emphatic. You have to actually put in the work, not just intellectual work, but you might say emotional, affective, volitional work as well. You have to reflect, you have to commit yourself and see what happens. You have to then step back and see what you think about what happened. You have to make choices that are often fateful, that close off this alternative if you pick this one. You have to also make choices which reaffirm themselves over and over again. Without doing that, there are many lessons, many concepts even in philosophy that just can't make sense for you. And when we get to religion and we get to faith, Kierkegaard would say, that's even more the case. Unless you actually do something, commit yourself, feel something, you are just not going to be able to fully comprehend what's going on. And the seductive thing is you will think that you comprehend it when you actually don't. So like he says, nobody can do the work for another. And when it comes to Abraham, he says, the story about Abraham is remarkable in that it is always glorious no matter how poorly it is understood. But here again, it is a matter of whether or not we are willing to work and be burdened. But we are unwilling to work, and yet we want to understand the story. Unless we work, unless we do the work, unless we keep doing the work, we're not going to get out of it what is there to get out of it. It's not something that's immediate, right there for us to just sort of pick up. It takes some doing. This is an important theme. He also does talk about this at another point in the epilogue, and this is talking about generations and whether progress has been made in the realm of spirituality and philosophy. He says, whatever one generation learns from another, no generation learns the essentially human from a previous one. In this respect, each generation begins primitively, has no task other than what each previous generation had, nor does it advance further insofar as the previous generations did not betray the task and deceive themselves. So we begin where Kierkegaard himself began. Kierkegaard himself begins where Socrates and the early followers of Christ or Abraham began. We all have to sort of put ourselves, not necessarily archaically back into that place, but existentially there in that same place. We have to realize that that's what it means to really be human. So that's an important theme. What about philosophy? Well, the philosophy and the culture of Kierkegaard's time, for the most part, was taking a position sort of like this. Faith is something that you begin with as a starting point. Faith is kind of inchoate. It's about feeling, it's about, beliefs that you had, and you're not quite sure why you have them. It's about hopes or wishes. It's about things that have been passed on to you that you buy into. It's about pictures, it's about images, it's about sentiments, narratives, all that sort of stuff. Faith is, in that sense, aesthetic. It's something which we like basically subjectively. I'm attracted to this. Can't say exactly why. And if I could say why, then I probably wouldn't have faith in it, too, by the way. If I realized that the reason why I want to look at icons is because they're pretty, then why don't I just look at other art, and then knock out the religious stuff, all those commitments. If I want to go to Mass because I get kind of a charge out of it, but I'm not really concerned about the sacramentality or lack of it or anything like that, maybe I should just, go to a rock concert instead. Those are things Kierkegaard would say in our own time. Well, in his own time, faith was being seen as something preliminary. And then, once you had faith, you could go on from there and do the real work, which was philosophy. And Hegel, who, like I said, Kierkegaard does criticize, Hegel was saying this. Hegel was saying Christianity as a religion, as the sort of religious part of the religion, not the philosophical part of the religion, is for the masses. It's for ordinary people who are not really willing to think and need to be satisfied with feeling more than anything else. But the real meat of it, the real meaning, the real rationality, the real greatness of it lies in what philosophy can make of it. So faith becomes rationalized. And there's a variety of ways to do this. I mean, Hegel is kind of a nice example here because Hegel did not do what many of the other Enlightenment philosophers did, which is just sort of, strip all sorts of things away. They did it in a negative way. Great example of that would be Thomas Jefferson, who was a deist, and who would be much more like the French Enlightenment figures. Deists believed that there couldn't be anything like miracles. So what did he do? He took his Bible and he just cut out all the passages where there are miracles. Literally cut them out. Then you get a much smaller Bible. You still have a Bible, so you still have, religion, but now you've purified it philosophically. Hegel was not quite so crude as that. As a matter of fact, Hegel criticizes that. But Hegel's doing something similar in his own way. He is saying, faith is just a starting point. What you really need to do is understand the concept of faith. You really need to understand what's going on there. Kierkegaard talks about this as everyone wanting to go on further than faith. That was a common thing in his own time. And I think this is very common in our time too. There is a tendency to take faith as being something fundamentally irrational to which our job is now to bring rationality in or pull the rationality of it out. Faith is not good enough by itself, is another way to put this. And Kierkegaard wants to do something very different. He wants to say, that's the wrong way to go about it. Philosophy, if it's going to be good philosophy, by good philosophy what I mean here is philosophy that is true to its own essence. Philosophy that takes its own obligations and tasks seriously. And its obligation and task is to understand reality, the human being's place in it, its own processes, and to put all those into a proper perspective. If philosophy is going to do that, then it has to realize that faith remains something, kind of a limit, kind of a threshold that it can go up to, but it can't get past. It can't get further than that. This is a very different conception of the relationship between philosophy and faith, isn't it? This is the conception that Kierkegaard is putting forth here. And the faith that one other thing I do want to say about this, the faith that he's talking about, it's not actually some pure irrationalist shot in the dark, jump into God knows what. It's actually an embrace of everything else, of finitude, of where we are, the human condition. In a certain way, faith can embrace the human condition in a way that philosophy can only wish that it could. So let's go on now. That introduces another important idea. And we're going to get to the night of faith in just a moment, the night of faith and the night of infinite resignation. But before that, I want to talk about passion. Kierkegaard conceives of faith as the highest passion. And he says that reflection by itself, thinking by itself, doesn't do anything. It doesn't accomplish anything. It doesn't produce anything. Passion, commitment, being pulled, being attracted, being driven is something that's required. And he says the highest passion is faith, but he does talk about several other passions that are very important in here. He talks about irony and humor as passions which are also to some degree reflective. They are good, there's something to them, but they're not going to get you where faith is. And if we want to think about it in terms of this totality of grasping life or reality, passions, not just intellection, not just thinking, not just speculation, but passions, feelings, commitments, living, acting, those are what reveal to us the world, the totality, who we are, who other people are, what else is out here, where are things lacking, where are things good, what should be done, what should not be done. It's not just thinking that reveals that, it's passion. And irony and humor reveal to us sides of the world that pure thought by itself wouldn't do. But it doesn't do what it is that faith does. What are some other passions? Love. Love is a passion as well. And Kierkegaard says you can tell the hero and the greatness of the hero by what it is that they love. There are many things we could love, many goods in this world. Do we love the highest one? Do we love the one that's most worthwhile? There are many things for which you could sacrifice yourself, or commit yourself, or sell everything else for. Do you pick the right one? Depending on how you love and what you love, the world will look different to you. It will open up sides to you that otherwise you might not see. What else? Joy. And, of course, it's in the very title, fear. Fear is itself a passion. This is interesting because Heidegger, another existentialist philosopher, who is, I would say, in many ways more indebted to Nietzsche than he is to Heidegger, or to Kierkegaard, he is going to take a certain type of affection which is connected with fear and make that one the one that reveals everything. A certain passion called anxiety or angst. Kierkegaard doesn't do that. It's faith that reveals it. But fear is important because what is the flip side of fear? What is connected with that? And yet opposed to it? Courage. And I do want to hit on something that Kierkegaard does say about courage. Actually, a few different things. Talking about himself, talking about the process that he's engaged in here in this book. And I think that this is also a great thing to think about when it comes to philosophy, particularly existentialist philosophy. He says, "As for me, I do not lack the courage to think a complete thought. Up until now I have feared none, and if I should encounter such a one, I hope that I at least would have the honesty to say, this thought makes me afraid, it shocks me, and therefore I will not think it." We live, many of us, in denial. We are unwilling to fully think out thoughts. We are unwilling to rely on the resources that are out there to fully think them out, including our own passional life. There are many things which if we wanted to fully understand things, we would have to think. But if they make us uncomfortable, we shy away from them. And that's a lack of courage. Intellectual courage doesn't just mean ticking people off or risking death. It means throwing yourself into the balance, throwing your very view of yourself, throwing your evaluation of yourself into the balance. That's much more important than what other people think. And that's what Heidegger does. That's what Kierkegaard does. I keep saying Heidegger. Where else does he talk about courage? Well, he talks about courage in terms of the two nights, the night of faith and the night of infinite resignation. In talking about the night of infinite resignation, he says he's not cowardly. He's not afraid to let it, which is the things that he loves, and the fact that they're vulnerable, and the fact that he may lose them, and maybe blocked from them forever. He's not afraid to let it steal into his most secret, his most remote thought, to let it twist and entwine itself intricately around every ligament of his consciousness. If his love comes to grief, he will never be able to wrench himself out of it. That is part of what it means to be a philosopher. It's not just to have read Kierkegaard or Russell or Kant. It's not enough to have tried on their thoughts imaginatively for a little while. It involves self-scrutiny. It involves looking at where one is vulnerable, what one is attracted to, what good things one would like to have, even loves, but fears the loss of, and to allow that to actually go into oneself, removing the blockages, removing the armor, removing all those things that stand in the way of genuine self-knowledge. That's part of what it requires to be what he calls the night of infinite resignation. He also talks about courage in a few other points. He says that the point of this whole exercise is to perceive the greatness of what Abraham did so that the person can judge for himself whether he has the vocation and the courage to be tried in something like this. So again, courage comes up in terms of Abraham. And then finally, earlier on in the expectoration, there's a long passage where he's, again, contrasting the night of infinite resignation, which appears to be him, and the night of faith, and he says, "I have seen the terrifying face to face, and I do not flee from it in horror, but I know very well that even though I advance towards it courageously, my courage is still not the courage of faith, and is not something to be compared with it. I cannot make the movement of faith. I cannot shut my eyes and plunge confidently into the absurd. It is for me an impossibility, but I do not praise myself for that." So there's two types of courage going on here. Or perhaps there's a lesser courage and a greater courage, and the lesser courage is maybe a reflection or an analog of the greater courage which the person of faith has, to trust in the absurd, to trust in God. So now let's actually talk about this key opposition, this key set of ideas. Kierkegaard is using terms like knight in part because they evoke chivalry, they evoke commitment, they evoke a time in which the individual committed him or herself. And we have the Knight of Infinite Resignation. And then we have the Knight of Faith. Now before we explore these, let's look at some other ways of life, some other alternatives that are not either of these. This is the best, the Knight of Faith. This is the second best. If you can't be this, then Kierkegaard is saying, and you really want to live a truly human life, be this. Don't be the other things. One of the things that he talks about is not necessarily bad, it's just not fully developed. He contrasts faith with naivety. And here's something important. In order to be a Knight of Faith, in order to have faith, you have to actually pass through the point of infinite resignation, according to Kierkegaard. That may be something where a lot of other religious people don't necessarily agree with Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard says, precisely because resignation is antecedent, faith is no aesthetic emotion, but something far higher. It is not the spontaneous inclination of the heart, but the paradox of existence. If, for example, in the face of every difficulty, a young girl still remains convinced that her desire will be fulfilled, this assurance is by no means the assurance of faith, even though she has been brought up by Christian parents, and perhaps she's had confirmation instruction from the pastor for a whole year. Why not? She is convinced in all her childlike naivete and innocence, and this assurance ennobles her nature and gives a supernatural magnitude so that, like a thaumaturge, she can invoke the finite powers of existence and bring the very stones to tears. He's not saying this is a bad thing. He's not saying, oh, get rid of innocence, wipe it out so that we can all be clever and, get as quickly as we can to the Knight of Infinite Resignation. No, as a matter of fact, that's a great thing. It's just not what faith is. It lacks a certain pathos, a certain depth. He says, her assurance is the most captivating, and one can learn much from her. But there's one thing that cannot be learned from her: how to make movements. She doesn't feel the pain of resignation. She doesn't feel the loss of it. She is not fully aware of the human condition. That's a fairly good thing to contrast this. Now let's look at some other things which are not faith and are not infinite resignation. One of these would be what we could call fake faith, or to use another term, cheap grace, riding somebody's coattails, you might say. He says, he's talking about the peak that Abraham stands on. The last stage to pass from his view is the stage of infinite resignation. All those travesties of faith, the wretched, lukewarm lethargy that thinks, there's no urgency, there's no use in grieving beforehand, the despicable hope that says, one just can't know what will happen, it could possibly be. These travesties are native to the paltriness of life, and an infinite resignation has already infinitely disdained them. So, the Knight of Infinite Resignation, before one proceeds to faith, is going to give up on any sort of, well, maybe things will turn out okay. God's up there in the heaven, who knows what he's going to do. Sort of, fatalistic attitude, or non-serious attitude, as well as a sort of uncommitted lethargy. Finally, there's another thing that he talks about, and again, he's talking about the Knight of Infinite Resignation here. What distinguishes that Knight of Infinite Resignation from some other types of people? He says, well, the Knight of Infinite Resignation has committed themselves. They have gone through a process in which they thought about goods and about what is necessary. He says, in the first place, the knight will have the power to concentrate the whole substance of his life and the meaning of actuality into one single desire. That's very important. One single desire. The Knight of Infinite Resignation is looking for one desire, one good. And they've looked at them, and they've decided on it, and they've figured out this is the best good for me. This is the one thing necessary, to use a biblical term. So he's concentrated the whole substance of his life and the meaning of actuality into one single desire. Here's the contrast. If a person lacks this concentration, this focus, his soul is dissipated in multiplicity from the beginning. And then he never manages to make the movement. He acts as shrewdly in life as the financiers who put their resources into widely diversified investments in order to gain on one if they lose on another. In short, he's not a knight. Not only does the knight do this with their desire, they do this with their thought, with their consciousness. He says, in the next place, the knight will have the power to concentrate the conclusion of all his thinking into one act of consciousness. If he lacks this focus, his soul is dissipated in multiplicity from the beginning, and he will never find time to make the movement. The movement being infinite resignation. He will never find time to make the movement. He will continually be running errands in life and will never enter into eternity. It's the concentration on one good, one desire, placing that into the balance and knowing you may not get it. And knowing that if you do get it, it may not have anything to do with your worthiness of getting it. And it may not be something that you keep forever. And being okay with it, becoming infinitely resigned. That's the preparatory move for faith, because that's the preparatory move that fully introduces you into what Kierkegaard calls eternal life, the eternal in human beings. This, he says, is what philosophy can do. This is what philosophy ought to do. That's all philosophy can do, though. That's as far as it can get. Although we have to ask, well, then how is all this stuff about the Knight of Faith being unpacked? That's a different question. We'll get to that a little bit later. Let's look at a few more characterizations of the infinite resignation. He has this great comparison. He talks about the Knights of Infinity who have renounced their desire and yet may still enjoy it, who are okay with things, who have worked themselves into that sort of state where things make sense, where even their suffering makes sense. He says they're sort of like ballet dancers. There are ballet dancers, the most difficult feat for a ballet dancer is to leap into a specific posture in such a way that he never once strains for the posture, but in the very leap assumes the posture. The Knights of Infinity, the Knights of Infinite Resignation come very, very close to doing that. But as they shift into the posture, there's a little bit of wavering. What is the posture? The posture is acceptance. Not just intellectual, but affective, passionate. And there's always a little bit of shift. There's always a little bit of glimmer. There's always something that gives them away. And this is where the Knight of Faith is, in some ways, very close to what is best in us. They grasp the world, they grasp reality. Like he says, what I gain in resignation is my eternal consciousness. This is a purely philosophical movement that I venture to make when it is demanded and can discipline myself to make. Because every time some finitude will take power over me. I starve myself into submission until I make the movement. For my eternal consciousness is my love for God, and for me that is the highest of all. But that's not yet faith. So let's move on to faith. What is the Knight of Faith? And here, Kierkegaard has this just brilliant depiction of him. The Knight of Faith, there's two things that I want to stress. One is, the Knight of Faith has faith in what? In God and in the absurd. And these are one. The Knight of Faith thinks that God cares about everything and will somehow, who knows how, make things turn out the way that they ought to. And so they can love the world and they can love the finitude of the world in a way that the knight of infinite resignation is unable to do. They can trust in God and God's capacity to make things sort out the way that they ought to, even when it seems totally impossible, totally absurd, in a way that the knight of infinite resignation can't. Because of that, like I said, they can love the finite. They can be okay with things in a passional way, in an affective way, that reveals to them the true sides of the world in a way that's not possible for the knight of infinite resignation. I'm going to read you a passage where it's one of my favorites from this book. He says, the knights of infinite resignation are easily recognizable. Their walk is light and bold. But they who carry the treasure of faith are likely to disappoint. Externally, they have a striking resemblance to bourgeois philistinism, which infinite resignation, like faith, deeply disdains. And so he introduces this character who would be the knight of faith. He says, here he is. The acquaintance is made. I am introduced to him. The instant I lay eyes on him, I set him apart at once. I jump back, clap my hands, and say, half aloud, good Lord, is this the man? Is this really the one? He looks just like a tax collector. But this is indeed really the one. I move a little closer to him, watch his slightest movement to see if it reveals a bit of heterogeneous optical telegraphy from the infinite, a glance, a facial expression, a gesture, a sadness, a smile that would betray the infinite in its heterogeneity with the finite. No. I examine his figure from top to toe to see if there may not be a crack through which the infinite would peek. No. He's solid all the way through. And he says, he takes pleasure in everything, takes part in everything. And every time one sees him participating in something particular, he does it with an assiduousness that marks the worldly man who is attached to these things. He attends to his job. He goes to church. In the afternoon, he takes a walk to the woods. He enjoys everything he sees. The swarms of people, the new omnibuses, the sound. Encountering him on Strandveien, one would take him for a mercantile soul enjoying himself. He finds pleasure in this way, for he's not a poet. Towards evening, he goes home. And this is my favorite part of it. And this is so telling. Towards evening, he goes home, and his gait is as steady as a postman's. On his way, he thinks his wife will surely have a special hot meal for him when he comes home. For example, roast lambs had with vegetables. If he meets a kindred soul, he would go on talking all the way to Oosterpoort about this delicacy with a passion befitting a restaurant operator. It so happens he does not have 4 shillings to his name, and yet he firmly believes that his wife has this delectable meal waiting for him. If she has, to see him eat would be the envy of the elite and an inspiration to the common man, for his appetite is keener than Esau's. His wife doesn't have it. Curiously enough, he is just the same. On the way, he passes a building site and meets another man. They converse for a moment, and in an instant he erects a building, and he has at his disposition everything required. He says, with the freedom from care of a reckless good-for-nothing, he lets things take care of themselves. And yet, every moment of his life, he buys the opportune time at the highest price. For he does not do even the slightest thing except by virtue of the absurd. And yet, yes, I could be infuriated over it if for no other reason than envy. This man is made and at every moment is making the movement of infinity. He drains the deep sadness of life in infinite resignation. He knows the blessedness of infinity. He has felt the pain of renouncing everything, the most precious things in the world. And yet the finite, here's the key thing, the finite tastes just as good to him as one who never knew anything higher. Because his remaining infinitude would have no trace of a timorous, anxious routine, and yet he has the security that makes him delight in it as if finitude were the surest thing of all. This is what faith is for him. He has resigned everything infinitely, and then he has grasped everything again by virtue of the absurd. So, this is something really key. What it is to have faith is not just to have a sort of irrational, blind commitment. It is actually to, like he says, renounce everything and then get things back because one trusted. To be willing. And that's why Abraham is a picture of this. What did Abraham do? If you think about his story, this is where we're going to end. Abraham was commanded by God not just to take this good or that good or this good, but to take the highest good, the best thing, his own son. The son of promise, the son that everything depended on. God said things like, I'm going to make you the father of many peoples. He gave a son to Sarah in her old age so that she could actually feel fulfilled. And she trusted in him, and Abraham trusted. And then God says, all right, you got to give that up. You have to give it up, and not just give it up right now. You actually have to make the movements. You have to go over there. That's 4 days' journey to Mount Horeb. And you have to sacrifice your son. You have to do the actual movements, the processes. You have to do them this way. God tests him. And Abraham passes the test precisely by going through infinite resignation and then trusting. This is where one regains the finite. No longer as the finite, just by itself. That would be a worldly way. But as part of the infinite, as satisfying for what is infinite and eternal in human beings. So, that's where we're going to leave off. Next, we're actually going to discuss these three famous problemata, and we're going to look at, first, the teleological suspension